Ethan Walters had no idea what he was getting himself into when he shaved the head of his family's maid, Maya Johnson. He thought it was a joke, something to amuse his friends and show off his power. His parents, seated in the corner of the luxurious living room, laughed along with him, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit them. Maya stood there, her eyes hardening as the sound of the razor buzzed in the air, the cut strands of hair falling to the ground. The rich boy, surrounded by his wealth and confidence, didn't realize the depths of the woman he had just humiliated. Maya didn't respond. She didn't yell, didn't cry out. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her gaze locked on Ethan's smirking face. The room filled with laughter, but Maya's silence was louder than any words. She knew exactly what this moment meant. It wasn't just about hair. It was about control, respect, and power, all of which Ethan had just destroyed in the most careless of ways. As Maya turned and quietly walked out of the room, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He laughed it off, thinking she would forget. After all, she was just a maid. What could she possibly do? But Maya wasn't just any maid. She wasn't someone who could be humiliated without consequences. The next day, the Walters family awoke to a shocking surprise. Their $2 billion empire, built over decades of hard work, was teetering on the edge of collapse. A series of financial deals, once thought to be solid, had suddenly turned into a nightmare. Millions were lost, investments vanished, and creditors started knocking on their door. The name Walters became synonymous with failure overnight. What Ethan hadn't known, what no one in that room had realized, was that Maya had been quietly observing the family for months. She knew things that could destroy them. Using her intelligence and the information she had quietly gathered, Maya had orchestrated a series of moves that would unravel the Walters empire. She didn't need violence or public humiliation to make her point. All she needed was patience, precision, and the right moment to strike. Ethan's parents, once so confident in their wealth, were now scrambling to figure out what had gone wrong. The empire they had built, the one they thought would last forever, was crumbling before their eyes. And there, in the center of it all, was Maya, a woman they had once mocked, a woman they had underestimated. Now she held the power to destroy them. The Walters family had always looked down on Maya. To them, she was just an employee, someone to be used and discarded. But Maya wasn't the type to be dismissed. She had spent her life learning, watching, and biding her time. And now the time had come for her to rise. The very empire the Walters family had so carefully constructed was being dismantled, piece by piece, and they didn't even know who to blame. Maya didn't care about their wealth, their power, or their status. All she wanted was justice. The Walters thought they were untouchable. But Maya proved, in the most devastating way possible, that no one is truly invincible. The next morning, Maya woke up in her modest apartment, the sound of the city outside just beginning to stir. She looked out the window, the sun barely breaking over the skyline. It was a new day, and the quiet hum of the streets below seemed to match the calm in her heart. She wasn't angry. She wasn't seeking revenge. No, Maya had something much more powerful than anger. She had a plan. As she dressed for the day, her thoughts drifted back to the events that had unfolded just hours before. The laughter, the sneers, the feeling of humiliation. It was all still fresh in her mind. But rather than letting it consume her, she had turned it into something else. She had transformed it into the fuel she needed to bring down the empire that had long thought it could do whatever it wanted without consequence. Maya knew she couldn't fight them head-on, not with violence, not with noise. The Walters family, with all their wealth and influence, would never be touched by anything so trivial. But Maya wasn't here to play by their rules. She had something more powerful than money. She had knowledge. She had patience. And most importantly, she had the drive to see it through. As the morning passed, Maya made a few phone calls, sent a few emails, and then, with calm precision, began to execute the first step of her plan. She had carefully studied the Walters family's finances, their investments, their business dealings. She had watched their every move, listened to their every conversation. She knew their weaknesses, and she was about to exploit them. By the time the Walters family had finished their breakfast, their world was already starting to fall apart. It started small, a few red flags on their financial reports, a couple of missed payments, a discrepancy in their overseas accounts. Then came the legal notices, the demands from creditors they thought they had under control. Maya had orchestrated it all from behind the scenes, her actions quiet and calculated. Ethan Walters, who had laughed at Maya the night before, was now watching his family's empire begin to crack. He couldn't understand what was happening. No one could. Maya's plan was flawless. She knew exactly where to hit, when to hit, and how to make it hurt without anyone ever suspecting a thing. The Walters family tried to fight back, of course. They had the money, the lawyers, and the connections to make it all go away. But it wasn't enough. Maya had already covered her tracks. By the time they realized the extent of the damage, it was too late. The empire they had spent decades building was on the verge of collapse. Maya wasn't finished yet. She knew that it wasn't just about the money, it wasn't just about the business. It was about proving a point. It was about showing them that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, could get away with treating people like they were nothing. Maya didn't want their wealth. She didn't need their money. She had her own, and it wasn't built on the backs of others. But she would use her knowledge of their empire, the cracks she had found in their facade, to bring them to their knees. As the day wore on, Maya's phone buzzed with updates. Her plan was unfolding exactly as she had imagined. The Walters family was reeling, unsure of how to respond. Their top executives were scrambling to find answers, their accountants working overtime to trace the problem. But it was already too late. Maya had them, exactly where she wanted them. By the time the sun set, Maya knew she had won. The Walters family's empire was falling apart, and it was all because of one decision. A decision Ethan had made the night before, thinking it was just a harmless prank. He had no idea that in humiliating Maya, he had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the destruction of everything his family had built. And Maya? She was just getting started. As the days passed, the Walters family tried desperately to restore order, but the cracks in their empire only deepened. Ethan Walters, who had once walked through life with the swagger of privilege, now found himself in a constant state of panic. His once comfortable world had turned upside down, and he didn't know who to blame or where to start fixing things. He had never imagined that his careless actions the night before could lead to something so catastrophic. His father, William Walters, was pacing the vast marble floors of their mansion, his face taut with frustration. Elizabeth, his mother, stared out the window, trying to make sense of the mess that was rapidly consuming their lives. Their son, Ethan, had been the golden child, the one who would take over the empire. Now, he was the one who had put it all at risk. The family had tried everything. They hired the best financial experts, sought legal counsel from the most powerful firms, and even called in favors from people who owed them. But nothing was working. Each effort seemed to lead to more questions, more problems. Maya had planned every move with precision. She had made sure there were no obvious traces back to her, no fingerprints, no records. She had watched and learned, and now the Walters family was being undone by their own arrogance. The shockwaves of the financial collapse rippled through the business world, and the Walters family found themselves at the center of a storm they couldn't weather. Investors were pulling out, contracts were being canceled, and creditors were knocking down their door. The media caught wind of the scandal, and soon enough, their once revered name was being dragged through the mud. Maya watched it all unfold from the shadows, her heart steady, her mind focused. She had already seen the outcome, and now she was simply waiting for the final pieces to fall into place. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't celebrating. She had simply done what she needed to do. Maya had never wanted their wealth, never craved the power they had. What she wanted was something far more valuable: respect. She had spent her entire life overlooked, underestimated, and belittled. But now, those who had mocked her, those who had thought they could trample over her, were facing the consequences of their actions. It wasn't just about the money. It was about showing them that no one is above the law of respect and justice. One afternoon, as Maya sat in the small cafe she frequented, her phone buzzed with an update. She had been waiting for this moment, and now it had arrived. The final blow had been struck. The Walters family was no longer a name people respected. Their empire was crumbling, and the once unassailable throne they had sat upon was now nothing more than rubble. Maya didn't feel satisfaction. She didn't feel triumph. She felt calm. She had been the catalyst, but the real work was done now. It wasn't about destroying them. It was about proving a point. Maya's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from an anonymous source. "They're finished. You've made your mark." Maya read the message and, for the first time in a long time, allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't for the destruction of the Walters family. It wasn't for the chaos she had unleashed. It was because, for the first time in her life, someone had finally seen her. And that was enough. Ethan Walters sat in his father's office, his face pale and his hands trembling. He had tried to call Maya, tried to reach out to her, but she had never responded. She had disappeared, leaving him to face the fallout of his actions. His father was furious, but even William Walters couldn't hide the truth. Ethan had brought this upon them all. The Walters family empire had been built on a foundation of arrogance and disdain for those they considered beneath them. Maya had shown them that no one, not even the richest or most powerful, could escape the consequences of their actions. As Ethan sat there, staring at the pile of financial papers and legal documents in front of him, he realized something. The Walters family was finished, and it was all because of one woman. One woman who had once been nothing more than a maid, but who now held the power to destroy everything they had worked for. And Ethan knew, deep down, that no matter how much money or power they had, they would never be able to fix the damage she had done. It was too late for that. The Walters family had been rocked to their core. The sudden collapse of their empire wasn't something they had expected. The ripple effects of their downfall had spread quickly, and soon enough the media caught wind of their financial troubles. News outlets that had once praised William Walters as a business genius now called him a fraud. The world that had once admired them now looked on with disdain. The wealthy family who had lived in luxury for so long was now facing the harsh reality of their actions. They had underestimated Maya Johnson, the woman they had treated as nothing more than an employee, someone easily discarded. But Maya was no longer the woman they had mocked. Maya had become something they had never anticipated, a force to be reckoned with. As the Walters family scrambled to save face, Ethan Walters could barely look his father in the eye. He had always been the golden boy, the one who was supposed to take over the family business, but now he was just another part of the wreckage. Every time he tried to make a phone call to salvage the situation, every attempt to fix what he had broken only seemed to make it worse. His father, once so confident, now looked like a man on the edge of despair. "You've ruined us, Ethan," William Walters muttered, his voice barely audible. "This was your mistake. Your recklessness has cost us everything." Ethan felt the weight of his father's words. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It wasn't even about the empire. It was about the trust they had built over the years, the respect they had once commanded, and now it was all slipping away. Ethan had no answers, no solutions. The more he thought about it, the more it dawned on him how utterly helpless he had become. Maya's name had become a symbol of their downfall, a reminder of their arrogance, of the way they had treated her like nothing more than a servant. Ethan couldn't escape the fact that Maya, the woman they had dismissed, had brought them to their knees without ever lifting a finger. She had used her intelligence, her quiet power, to destroy everything they had worked so hard to build. And they had no idea how to stop it. Meanwhile, Maya watched it all from the sidelines, her heart calm, her mind sharp. She wasn't celebrating their destruction. She wasn't looking for any recognition. What mattered was that she had made her point, and the Walters family could no longer ignore her. The money, the power, and the prestige they had once taken for granted were now gone. Maya wasn't interested in seeing them beg for forgiveness. She had never asked for anything. What she wanted was for them to learn, to understand what it felt like to be overlooked, to be treated like nothing. And now they were experiencing that pain. It was a bitter irony that the very thing they had used to belittle her was the thing that had brought them to ruin. Maya's actions had been a quiet storm, a storm that had slowly built up over time. She had seen the cracks in their empire long before they had ever noticed. It had started with their disregard for her, their assumption that she was just another face in the crowd. But Maya was far from ordinary. She had spent years learning, studying, and preparing for this moment. She had known that someday, someone would underestimate her. And when they did, she would be ready. And now, the Walters family was paying the price. Maya had never needed them to fall. She had never needed their wealth or their power. All she had wanted was justice. She had watched as they trampled over people like her, people who were never given a voice, never given a chance. Now, they were the ones who had been silenced. As Maya sat in her small apartment, she didn't feel joy. She didn't feel satisfaction. She felt peace. The world around her might still be chaotic, but for the first time in her life, she had taken control of her own destiny. The Walters family, once so confident in their wealth and status, were now learning the hard way that power could be fleeting, and no one was invincible. Maya had made sure of that. Days passed, and the Walters family's situation only worsened. Ethan Walters sat at the head of the large, cold conference table in the family's private office, surrounded by lawyers, financial advisors, and even a few of the family's closest allies. But none of them had answers. The reports were worse than anyone could have imagined. The empire his family had spent decades building was unraveling before their very eyes. Ethan's hands trembled as he looked at the stack of papers before him. Every attempt to restore their financial standing had failed. The investors were pulling out, the banks were closing in, and the press had caught wind of every detail, making sure the world knew the Walters family was on the brink of collapse. His father, once a pillar of strength, was barely speaking. William Walters, the man who had once commanded entire industries, was now reduced to sitting in the corner of the office, his face grim, his shoulders heavy with the weight of failure. Ethan had tried everything, from reaching out to old business contacts to using every ounce of influence his family still had, but nothing was working. The more he pushed, the more the walls seemed to close in on him. The Walters were no longer the people they had been just days ago. The life they had taken for granted had been stripped away, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. They had made enemies, yes, but the true enemy was not the people who had plotted against them. It wasn't the competitors or the journalists. The real enemy was the truth, the uncomfortable reality that their empire had been built on arrogance and neglect. Maya Johnson had exposed that truth. She had taken down everything they had worked for, not through force or violence, but through a quiet, calculated strategy. Maya wasn't like the Walters. She didn't have the luxury of billions of dollars, private jets, or an army of lawyers at her disposal. She didn't need any of it. What she had was intelligence, patience, and the ability to see things others couldn't. The Walters family had overlooked her for years, seeing her as nothing more than a maid, someone to be dismissed and forgotten. But Maya was not the person they thought she was. She had watched them, learned from them, and understood their weaknesses long before they had even noticed her. And now it was all falling apart. Maya, meanwhile, continued her life in the quiet anonymity she had always embraced. She didn't feel joy from watching the Walters family's downfall. It wasn't about their wealth, their status, or their power. It had never been about that. It had always been about showing them, and everyone else, that no one could escape the consequences of their actions. No one, no matter how high they climbed, was above the laws of justice and respect. The Walters family had made a grave mistake by treating her as invisible, as less than human. But now they were the ones who were invisible, while Maya stood in the light, showing them what it meant to be truly seen. The days grew longer, and the Walters business empire continued to crumble. The media had already made their judgment, and the world had turned against the once revered family. It wasn't just the collapse of their fortune that hurt. It was the collapse of everything they had built. The trust, the power, the respect, they had all evaporated. The final nail in the coffin came when Maya revealed one last piece of information. She didn't do it for recognition. She didn't do it for fame. She did it because it was the final proof of what she had known all along. The Walters family, in their pursuit of wealth and control, had broken the law, had broken the trust of countless people, and now they were paying the price. Maya had made sure of that. As the Walters family sat in the wreckage of their empire, it was clear to everyone, even to Ethan, that Maya had won. She had taken nothing from them, and yet, she had taken everything. They had underestimated her. They had thought her small, insignificant, and weak. But Maya was none of those things. She was the storm they had never seen coming, the reckoning they had never imagined. And in the end, she was the one who stood tall while they were left in the ruins of their once immense empire. As the weeks passed, the Walters family found themselves in an irreversible freefall. Their fortune was lost, their name tarnished, and the future of their business uncertain. Ethan Walters had once been the golden child, destined to take over his family's empire. Now he wandered the halls of their mansion like a ghost, a shell of the confident young man he once was. The weight of his actions had sunk in, and with it came the crushing realization that his family's downfall was his doing. His father, William Walters, had always been a towering figure, a man with a sharp mind and unshakable resolve. But now William was barely recognizable. The lines on his face had deepened, his eyes were tired, and his every step seemed heavy. The empire they had built was slipping through their fingers, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Ethan had tried everything to fix the situation. He had made calls to their investors, spoken to their legal team, and even considered drastic measures to protect what was left. But it was all in vain. Maya Johnson, the woman they had dismissed, had already executed a perfect plan to dismantle everything they had built. The quiet, unassuming Maid had taken down the Walters family with the precision of a surgeon. She had seen the cracks in their empire long before they had. She had watched them, learned their secrets, and waited. And when the time was right, she had struck. What the Walters didn't understand was that it wasn't about the money. It had never been about the wealth or the power. Maya had wanted justice, plain and simple. She had spent her entire life being overlooked, underestimated, and treated as invisible. But now, those who had once seen her as nothing more than a servant were now the ones who were invisible. Maya had made them feel the very pain they had inflicted on so many others. While the Walters family scrambled to pick up the pieces, Maya moved on with her life. She had made her point, and she didn't need to stick around to see the final act unfold. She had done what she set out to do. She had torn down their empire not with force or anger, but with quiet determination. It wasn't a victory, but a statement. Maya didn't need their money, their power, or their approval. She had everything she needed within herself. The Walters family, on the other hand, had been exposed for what they truly were. People who had built their empire on the backs of others, who thought they were untouchable, and who had no idea what it meant to truly respect someone. Ethan Walters spent his days in a haze of regret, watching his father try to salvage the remnants of their fortune. But no amount of money could repair the damage that had been done. Maya had won, not because of her intellect or her strategy, but because she had shown them the truth. She had made them realize that no one, not even the wealthiest and most powerful, could escape the consequences of their actions. In the end, it wasn't about revenge or justice, it was about something deeper. Maya had proved that the real power wasn't in the money or the status. The real power was in knowing your worth and standing up for yourself, even when no one else would. Maya Johnson had done that, and while the Walters family sat in the wreckage of their empire, Maya had already moved on. She didn't need to be a part of their world. She had created her own, and in doing so, had shown them that they were never as powerful as they had believed. The family that once looked down on her was now looking up to her. They had no choice but to see her for what she truly was. Someone who could never be broken, no matter what they did. Maya didn't need to say anything to them. She didn't need their apology or their recognition. She had already proven everything she needed to prove. And as the Walters family's empire continued to crumble, one thing was clear. Maya had become the person they had never expected. The person they had once thought insignificant had become the one who brought them to their knees, and there was nothing they could do to undo it. The Walters family's downfall was now a public spectacle. The media continued to cover the collapse of their empire, feeding on the tragic irony that a family once considered untouchable had been brought down by their own arrogance. Ethan Walters, the son who had once been the heir to it all, now stood at the edge of a precipice. His confidence was shattered, and every day felt like a heavy reminder of what he had lost. His father, once a man of immense power, now sat quietly in his office, staring out at the city skyline. He had always been the one to lead, to command respect, but now that respect had vanished. No amount of money or influence could undo the damage that had been done. The Walters family had never understood the value of humility, but Maya had made them understand it in the most painful way possible. The family's lawyers worked overtime, scrambling to figure out how to salvage whatever they could. But the situation was beyond repair. Their investors had pulled out, their assets were frozen, and the world had turned against them. They could no longer hide behind their wealth or their power. Maya, on the other hand, had disappeared from the spotlight, leaving behind a world of chaos in her wake. She wasn't interested in being a part of their drama, and she certainly didn't want to bask in the public's newfound admiration for her. She had never sought fame, recognition, or revenge. All she had wanted was to show the Walters family that they were not invincible, that their actions had consequences. And she had done just that. Maya's life had returned to normal, but there was a part of her that couldn't help but reflect on what had happened. The world around her continued as it always had, but she had changed, and in some ways so had the world around her. She no longer saw herself as invisible. She had been seen, not because of her appearance or her status, but because of her strength, her intelligence, and her resolve. The Walters family, once so sure of their place at the top, had learned that no one was truly untouchable. They had learned the hard way that wealth and power could only take you so far. And now, as they sat in the ruins of their empire, the Walters family could do nothing but face the reality of their situation. Maya had proven a point. They had thought they could ignore her, belittle her, and use her as a pawn in their game. But in the end, she had taken control, and they had been powerless to stop it. Ethan, for all his privilege and wealth, was left with nothing but regret. He had spent his life thinking he was untouchable, that his family's money and influence would shield him from the world's harsh realities. But now he was just like everyone else. He was no longer the golden child. He was a man who had made a grave mistake, and there was no undoing it. William Walters had always believed that power was everything, that money could solve any problem. But now, as he stared at the empty office, he realized that power meant nothing if it wasn't used with respect. The world had changed, and the Walters family had failed to keep up. They had been blinded by their own arrogance, and now they were paying the price. Maya had not only taken down their empire, she had forced them to face the reality that power without integrity was nothing. As the days went by, the Walters family faded into the background, their once great name tarnished beyond repair. Maya, on the other hand, had built something more valuable than wealth or fame. She had built her own legacy, a legacy not of riches, but of strength and resilience. The Walters family may have had it all once, but in the end, it was Maya who had proven that the true measure of power is not in how much you can control, but in how you choose to stand when the world tries to break you. The Walters family's name was now synonymous with failure. It seemed impossible to think that just a few weeks ago, they had been untouchable, the epitome of wealth and influence. Now their empire was reduced to rubble, their reputation forever tainted. Ethan Walters couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. Every time he walked through the halls of the mansion, it felt colder, emptier, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. He had been the golden boy, the one with everything handed to him. Now he was a man without a future, without purpose. His family's fortune was gone, their legacy shattered, and there was no one left to blame but himself. His father, once the patriarch of the family, now sat silently, his eyes vacant as he stared out at the city skyline. William Walters had always believed that wealth was the ultimate form of power, that with money, anything was possible. But now, he understood that money alone could not save them. No amount of wealth could restore the respect they had lost, or rebuild the empire that had been built on arrogance and disregard for others. It was a painful realization, one that he could no longer ignore. Maya Johnson, the woman they had dismissed and belittled, had turned their world upside down. She hadn't used brute force or tried to fight them head-on. No, she had done something far more dangerous. She had used their own arrogance against them. With quiet precision, she had taken apart everything they had built, piece by piece. And in doing so, she had made them realize something they had never considered: power without integrity is meaningless. Maya had already moved on with her life, her actions completed. She didn't need to stay and watch the Walters family's downfall unfold. She had no interest in their misery. She had only wanted to prove a point. And now, with the dust settling, she had done exactly that. The Walters were left to pick up the pieces, to try and figure out how they could survive after everything they had lost. But no matter how hard they tried, there was no coming back from this. The world had seen them for who they truly were, and there was no erasing that. Maya's life had returned to its quiet rhythm. She wasn't a millionaire. She didn't have the lavish lifestyle that the Walters had once enjoyed. But she had something far more valuable: respect. She had earned it, not through wealth, but through her actions. And that was more than enough for her. As the days passed, the Walters family continued to fade into obscurity. The media had lost interest, moving on to the next scandal. But the scars of their fall would remain, etched into their legacy forever. Ethan, once full of ambition and certainty, now found himself wondering how everything had gone wrong. It was easy to point fingers, to blame the outside forces that had contributed to their downfall. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had brought this upon them. He had thought he was untouchable, invincible. But Maya had shown him that no one is above the consequences of their actions. Maya had never been interested in wealth or power. She had only wanted one thing: to be seen. And in the end, she had achieved that. The Walters family had spent their lives looking down on her, treating her as less than human. And now they were the ones who had been made to look small. The world had turned its gaze on them, and there was no escaping the truth. Ethan had learned the hardest lesson of all. Power and money mean nothing if you don't have the integrity to back them up. Maya's actions had proven that in the most devastating way possible. The Walters family had thought they were invincible, but Maya had shown them that no one is truly untouchable. They had built their empire on the backs of others, but in the end, it was their own arrogance that had brought them down. Maya had taken nothing from them, and yet she had taken everything. She had made them feel the weight of their own mistakes, and there was no redemption for them. Ethan sat alone in the study, staring at the empty desk in front of him. He had once believed that wealth and power could fix anything. Now he understood how wrong he had been. He had everything and lost it all. And Maya? She had nothing but herself. And she had proven that was enough. Months had passed, and the Walters family had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Ethan Walters, once the heir to a multimillion-dollar empire, now worked from a small, cluttered office, surrounded by papers and unpaid bills. The towering mansion that had once stood as a symbol of their power now felt empty, echoing with the silence of what once was. The family's fortune was gone, and their name was tarnished beyond repair. They had tried everything to rebuild, but it was too late. The public had already turned their back on them. Investors were no longer willing to back them, and their former allies had distanced themselves. The Walters family was no longer welcome in the high society circles they had once dominated. William Walters, once a man who could command respect with a single word, now spent his days in solitude. His wealth had failed him, and the respect he had once demanded had evaporated. It was a bitter pill to swallow for a man who had spent his life believing that power was the ultimate goal. Ethan had inherited his father's ambition, but unlike his father, Ethan had no idea how to recover from such a crushing defeat. He had thought that money and influence would always protect him, but now he knew the truth. Power without integrity was nothing. Maya Johnson, on the other hand, continued her life in quiet satisfaction. She didn't need to see the Walters family suffer to know that she had won. Her actions had been about something greater than revenge. They had been about proving a point. Maya had spent her life in the shadows, invisible to those who had power and wealth. But now she had turned that power back on them. She had shown them that no one, no matter how rich or influential, could escape the consequences of their actions. Maya wasn't interested in the wealth that the Walters family had once flaunted. She didn't need it. What she had proven was worth far more than money. Maya had earned respect, the kind of respect that came from strength, intelligence, and an unyielding determination. She had not only taken down their empire, but she had done it on her own terms, without ever needing to stoop to their level. The Walters family may have had all the money in the world, but Maya had something they would never have: the ability to stand tall and face the world without hiding behind the walls of wealth and privilege. As the months turned into years, the Walters family slowly faded from the public eye. The empire they had worked so hard to build was gone, and with it, the respect they had once commanded. They tried to rebuild, but it was clear that nothing would ever be the same. Maya's life, however, moved forward. She had found peace in knowing that she had made a difference. She had shown the world that even the smallest voice could echo through the corridors of power. She didn't need to be in the spotlight. She didn't need the recognition. What mattered was that she had been seen. The Walters family, for all their wealth and influence, had learned the hard way that no one was untouchable. Money and power could only take you so far. In the end, it was integrity and respect that truly mattered. Ethan Walters sat in his small office, looking out the window at the city below. It was a far cry from the view he had once enjoyed from his family's mansion. The skyline, once a symbol of his family's dominance, now seemed distant and out of reach. He had everything once, and lost it all. And the person who had taken it